Content warning. This video discusses a lot of fictional violence as found within the play Titus Andronicus, including but not limited to bodily mutilation, amputation, rape, murder, and cannibalism. If these topics disturb or upset you, this may not be the video for you. I'm not the first person to call Titus Andronicus a slasher. As far back as Shakespearean criticism goes, people have bashed this play, calling it a heap of rubbish, obviously intended to excite vulgar audiences by its scenes of blood and horror, to our ear shocking and disgusting. More modern critics confer. As one book blogger put it, "Look, I get it. The 15 and 1600s were brutal. But what I don't appreciate, William, is reading a play that includes a man being burned alive and his arms cut off, filicide, a man being murdered and thrown into a pit, and also the brutal raping and mutilation of a woman." She forgot the part where some guys are baked into a pie and fed to their own mother, but, well, this sums up the brutal, almost cartoonish violence of Shakespeare's first tragedy pretty well. For the uninitiated, Titus Andronicus is a play that follows two families in a bloody cycle of revenge that ultimately kills off almost every single character. Sorry, spoilers, but we probably ought to summarize. Bear with me here, because I'm going to have to leave out a lot. I highly recommend reading the original if you haven't already. It's available in its entirety on Folger's Shakespeare Library. Link in the description. The play begins on the heels of a bloody war between Rome and the Goths. Titus Andronicus has just returned back from war and brings with him his prisoners, Tamora, queen of the Goths, and her 3 sons. As revenge for her killing 21 of his own sons, Titus sacrifices Tamora's eldest, setting off the grief that will drive the rest of the plot. The Roman emperor of the time, Saturninus, doesn't help matters when he takes Tamora for a wife, offering her far more power and influence to get her revenge. The Goth revenge plot begins during a royal hunt, wherein Tamora's remaining sons, Chiron and Demetrius, kill the fiancé of Titus's daughter, Lavinia, and rape her. They also cut out her tongue and cut off her hands, ensuring she can't tell or write who her attackers were. Lavinia's uncle Marcus is the one to discover her in the woods, and he spends a good 3.5 minutes soliloquizing about the crimson river of warm blood, like to a bubbling fountain stirred with wind, that doth rise and fall between thy rosed lips, coming and going with thy honeyed breath. To make matters worse, Tamora's lover Aaron has framed Titus's last 2 surviving sons for the attack, and the Roman emperor promises to have them killed. This, combined with the sight of his ravaged daughter, leaves Titus near to insanity. Titus's last remaining son, Lucius, has been in exile, but, hearing of the situation with his family, he rushes back to Rome. As their revenge plot reaches its end, Titus tricks Tamora into attending a feast with him. Little does she know he has secretly killed her sons and had them baked into a pie, which is served to Tamora at this very feast. The feast ends in traded bloodshed as Titus kills Lavinia and Tamora, Saturninus kills him, and Lucius, Titus's son, who has just returned from exile, kills him. After all of that, Lucius is given the title of emperor and peace is pledged between the Goths and Rome. Whew, that was a lot. Apart from being super violent, it's also probably Shakespeare's most well-hated production. Its extreme violence and melodrama turn a lot of people off. After all, this is Shakespeare. Isn't it supposed to be, highbrow? I'd argue, though, that these disgusted initial reactions actually prevent us from understanding and appreciating this awesome play, both historically and in the modern context of, yes, the slasher. Although the play lacks a few little details, namely a single murderer lurking in the dark with a mask, I think there are other elements that more than make up for that, namely extreme self-satisfying violence, modern cultural anxieties and a dash of moralizing, and its very own final girl. I may not be the first to call Titus Andronicus a slasher, but I think I might be the first to do it in a non-disparaging way. So, let's dive into Shakespeare's very first tragedy and find some echoes to the past in our modern slasher cinema. The slashing. I've already hinted at this a little bit with the less than impressed reviews, But Titus Andronicus is an extremely violent play. There's rape, murder, mutilation, and even non-consensual cannibalism packed into this thing. I wouldn't blame anyone for being disgusted by this play. However, what makes Titus Andronicus especially slasher-like isn't just its violence, but that particular quality of it that earns it all the hate in the first place. In Titus Andronicus, we don't just kill our enemies, we kill them and bake them into a pie that we trick their mother into eating. In Titus Andronicus, we don't just cut out a woman's tongue. We witness, as scholar Emma Smith humorously puts it, a young, traumatized, bleeding woman being apostrophized by a middle-aged man for the entire duration of, say, ABBA's Dancing Queen. Yeah, the speech really does last that long. In Titus Andronicus, there is a quality of exaggeration and focus on the violence that you can't find just anywhere, reminiscent of disturbing, blood-soaked sequences from classics like Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Friday the 13th. This bloody, sleazy mess of a play would qualify for slasher status given its body count alone. However, that's not all it has going for it. It also has its very own final girl. What is a final girl? Cinema scholar Carol Clover first defined the final girl in her 1987 essay, Her Body, Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film, as having two important qualities. The final girl, 1, undergoes agonizing trials, and 2, virtually or actually destroys the antagonist and saves herself. There are a few other good defining terms for a final girl, like the fact that she's usually a morally pure contrast to the women around her. That is, she doesn't have sex. We all know the rules, right?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex. Big no-no! Big no!
I'm a dead man.
Sex equals death, okay? Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. No, the sin factor. It's a sin. It's an extension of number 1. And number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
Viewed in literal terms, it is hard to understand where a final girl might fit into the narrative of Titus Andronicus. After all, there is no one killer. All of the characters seem to take turns killing and mutilating each other in response to the other's atrocities, and the final Andronicus left at the end, Lucius, isn't even a girl. Luckily, though, he might not have to be. In his brilliant follow-up to Clover's essay, When the Final Girl is Not a Girl, Jeremy Marin deconstructs the trope of the male monster versus the final girl, arguing that the final girl is less of a gender than a concept. Thus, the monster of the slasher need not be male, and the final girl, likewise, need not be female. Monster to final girl is an archetype, a relationship, set up less by gendered terms and more by roles within a story. Just as the hero within the hero's journey can be a hobbit or an 11-year-old wizard rather than a traditional Odysseus, so can the final girl be Lucius, and the monster be the culture of violence and revenge which surrounds him. And so we have Lucius. He most certainly undergoes some agonizing trials, if that's what one would call the brutal death of your entire family. Like any good final girl, Lucius is a morally pure exemplar. He, more than anyone, deserves to survive, having returned from banishment, a brave and loyal man, leading an army of Goths to save his family. Although he isn't there from the start of the story, he sweeps in toward the end to pick up the pieces, the oldest and last surviving Andronicus, and heroically takes the helm to lead Rome back into peacetime. Most importantly, though, he does vanquish the killer. In uniting the Goths and Romans at the end, Lucius ensures the blood feud that has driven the plot thus far is as dead as, Billy Loomis. In an Elizabethan proto-slasher such as Titus Andronicus, it is no surprise that the final girl would have to be a man. She's a hero, after all. There is no world in which sympathetic Lavinia or even cartoonishly evil Tamora could have risen to the throne and taken it all for themselves, ending completely the cycle of revenge. So we come to modern cultural anxieties, and a dash of moralizing. Like any work written pre-say, 2015, we must remember that Titus Andronicus is a product of its time. And like any slasher, this play exemplifies the moral anxieties of its time. This time, they're just part of the Elizabethan era instead. That doesn't mean they're unfamiliar, though. Titus Andronicus was written during a long era of political turmoil in Britain, centered around uncertainties of succession in the... Well, you get it. The important thing is, we do get it. Our fictional worlds reflect our real-life anxieties all the time. And in Titus, the pseudo-ancient Rome acts, as scholar Paulina Hughes puts it, as an imaginary laboratory for political ideas. Not about Rome, but about Shakespeare's England. Furthermore, Titus Andronicus takes places that are sacred to us, noble, enviable families in large homes, similar to the ubiquitous suburban palace of today's horror, and creates within them sites of bloodshed and tragedy. Within its noble settings and well-educated characters, there lies great violence. In one line, characters quote Ovid's Metamorphosis. In the next, they use it as inspiration for their assault on a young woman. Scholar Emma Smith writes, "Here in Titus, the Renaissance project of rediscovering classical texts to build a moral and humanist society is fatally undermined. Reading the classics does not make Chiron and Demetrius better. It makes them worse. And the fact that the young child Lucius in the play is also studying the same text condemns the play world to the same moral and intellectual decay. Along with the base fears around the base violence of the play, there also exists the moral fear around the dangers of the time in which the author lived. If the good, noble, normal people in our world are capable of such carnage, what does that say about the rest of us?" It's no surprise, then, that Titus Andronicus has carried with it the same moral panic that modern audiences will recognize about violent movies and video games. The moral critique that followed the advent of slasher films, D&D, Call of Duty, and, yes, Titus Andronicus, unmasks society's moral anxieties using its themes and its villains. It's no coincidence that in the 2014 era of sex positivity, for example, horror flick It Follows showed us a cast terrorized by a sexually transmitted demon. From the very beginning, the horror in our horror has always reflected real fear. Conclusion. As far as I'm aware, no film directors have directly cited Titus Andronicus as their inspiration for the blood-curdling, knife-stabbing, gory fun we enjoy from them today. But it's hard to imagine the play as anything but a powerful spiritual ancestor to our modern horror. I mean, look at Lavinia. As she stands, bloody specter on the stage for nearly half the play, haunting the other characters wordlessly with her ruinous, it's hard not to imagine Carrie, another waif on the cusp of her womanhood, similarly ruined by the cruelties of her time. Both are woman turned victim, woman turned monster. Aren't they spiritual sisters? What Titus Andronicus proves is not that the slasher has literally existed all this time. It hasn't. But that our love for the genre has been able to exist all this time. Although it received backlash later, it enjoyed great popularity just after its publication. People loved it, and people still love it today, just in other forms. We create characters that we love and love to tear them up, not just for the fun of the gore, but to dissect through them the world in which we live. Titus Andronicus is unique because it creates a bridge we don't often imagine existing. The horror and the highbrow and the horror. Through this play, both can be one and the same.